Here's a number you've probably heard 100 times. Ancient humans only lived to 30. Picture a Stone Age hunter, creaky joints, gray hair, keeling over from old age while the tribe shrugs it off as expected. That image is almost entirely wrong, and the real explanation is stranger, and considerably darker, than simple aging. The trick lies in a statistical sleight of hand. The difference between life expectancy at birth and life expectancy after surviving childhood. Life expectancy at birth averages every single death in a population, including infants who die within hours of being born. That number is brutally sensitive to child mortality. Here's a simple way to see why that matters. Imagine 10 people. 5 die before age 5, a realistic rate for many ancient populations. The other 5 live to 70. Average those 10 deaths together, and you get a life expectancy at birth of roughly 36. But nobody in that group actually died at 36. Half the population lived a full life into old age. The average describes an experience nobody actually had. That's essentially what's happening with the famous Stone Age life expectancy of 30 statistic. The number is being dragged down almost entirely by catastrophic childhood mortality, not by widespread early death among adults. When researchers instead calculate life expectancy starting at age 15, after childhood's most dangerous years were survived, the picture flips. Studies of hunter-gatherer populations consistently show that someone who made it to 15 had a reasonable shot at living into their 60s or 70s. So why was childhood mortality so catastrophic? Infectious disease is the biggest factor, and counterintuitively, small hunter-gatherer bands were actually somewhat protected from it. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and epidemic tuberculosis required dense, settled populations to sustain transmission, something mobile foraging bands simply didn't provide. It was the agricultural revolution, with its crowded villages, close contact with livestock, and contaminated water supplies, that actually increased infectious disease mortality compared to the hunter-gatherer baseline. If uncovering the real story behind history's biggest myths interests you, subscribing means you'll catch every deep dive like this. Childbirth was the second major killer. Maternal mortality risk per birth in pre-modern populations sat around 1 to 2%, which sounds small until you factor in that women commonly gave birth 8 or more times across their lives. That compounds into a lifetime risk of dying in childbirth as high as 5 to 8%, something like 1 in 15 women. Hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor were the grimly consistent causes, all essentially untreatable without modern medicine. Then there's childhood mortality itself, and the scale is hard to fully absorb. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children in many pre-modern populations died before reaching adulthood, overwhelmingly within the first 2 years of life. These children weren't living short adult lives. They weren't living adult lives at all. And it's this single factor that drags the famous statistic down more than anything else. Violence and accidents added further risk, though researchers still debate exactly how much. And underlying nearly every category is one simple, often overlooked fact: no antibiotics. A minor infected wound that today clears up with a basic prescription could, before antibiotics, progress to fatal sepsis within days. This single medical gap explains far more of the ancient versus modern mortality difference than any assumption about weaker ancient bodies. So what did adult aging actually look like for those who survived childhood? The evidence is remarkable. Skeletal remains from elderly ancient individuals show the same degenerative changes we see today: arthritis, healed fractures, worn teeth. Contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, studied by anthropologists, including the Hadza of Tanzania, regularly include people living into their 70s and 80s, occupying genuinely important roles as knowledge holders and caregivers. This connects directly to something called the grandmother hypothesis, the evolutionary theory that post-reproductive women who lived into old age significantly boosted their descendants' survival through childcare and accumulated knowledge strong enough to shape human evolution itself. If ancient humans genuinely died uniformly at 30, there would be no evolutionary reason for humans to have evolved such a long post-reproductive lifespan at all. The existence of long-lived grandmothers is itself evidence that extended adult lifespans were a real, recurring feature of our species. There's also a methodological wrinkle worth knowing. Aging a skeleton becomes far less precise the older someone was at death, and for decades researchers lumped anyone over roughly 50 into one broad, old adult category. This systematically hid genuinely long lifespans. The Libban skeletal site in Ohio became a textbook case of this. Initial analysis suggested a short-lived population, but later reanalysis, with improved methods, revealed considerably more elderly individuals than first believed, a pattern that's repeated across many other ancient skeletal populations since. Comparative research across the Hadza, the Ake, and the Hiwi peoples found a strikingly consistent pattern. Mortality risk concentrated heavily in early childhood, dropping sharply through adolescence, then rising gradually after age 40 or 50. Mirroring modern mortality curves, just shifted higher at every age due to the absence of modern medicine. The single most common age of adult death across these populations clustered between 70 and 72 years old. Interestingly, the shift to agriculture wasn't a simple improvement either. Skeletal evidence from early farming populations shows reduced height, increased skeletal stress, worse dental health, and in some cases, even higher childhood mortality than hunter-gatherer populations experienced, sometimes called the Neolithic Mortality Crisis. The persistent died at 30 myth survives partly because it flatters the present, framing modernity as a straightforward triumph over a uniformly brutal past. But the more accurate picture is arguably more impressive. Modern medicine didn't dramatically extend the ceiling of human lifespan. Living into your 70s was always biologically possible. What modern medicine actually achieved was raising the floor, dramatically reducing how many people fail to survive childhood, childbirth, infection, and injuries that once would have been fatal. That's the real story hiding behind the number 30, darker in what it reveals about childhood and childbirth, and genuinely more remarkable in what it reveals about how long human adults have always been capable of living.